Right. I'm very excited to welcome my colleague, Dr. Ross Rubenstein, who's a professor and Dan E. Sweat Distinguished Chair in Educational and Community Policy in the Department of Public Management and Policy and a faculty fellow with the Georgia Policy Labs in the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. We're going to talk today about education policy. So very, very excited and looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, Ross.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to do this. I've seen some of your questions ahead of time, and I have to say I was incredibly impressed. I hope all of you are thinking about going into careers in policy because we need more people who can ask insightful questions like this and really try and get at the crux of issues. So hope you're enjoying the class. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing these questions too. So I'll just start with the first one. So the first one that a student submitted, the question is, why do you choose to focus on educational policy specifically? And really, what potential do you see in education policy to address major problems that we see in society right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, education you can think of in terms of having private benefits, but also having lots of public benefits. So when I say private benefits, I mean things like the fact that you're going to college and that you're going to have a college degree that's going to benefit you personally. You're going to make more money and you're probably going to be more successful. And so those benefits accrue to you. And in terms of public policy, we're probably less concerned with that. It's really up to you to invest in your education to the extent that it benefits you as an individual. So if education was like hamburgers, for example, where you're the only ones that get the benefit from it, then we wouldn't really care about policy related to it so much. But education has all of these tremendous public benefits, spillovers, positive things that can affect other people and affect society. So there's lots of research on this. And we know, of course, one of the most obvious things that most people know is that education is related to future income. The more education you have on average, the more likely it is that you're going to have higher income. And so that benefits you, but it also means that you're going to pay more in taxes, and paying more in taxes benefits everybody. It also adds to productivity in the economy and economic growth, and that can benefit society as a whole. But education is also related to things that aren't as closely aligned with education. So for example, we know that people who have at least high school degrees are less likely to be incarcerated. Education is related to less crime. Education is related to better health outcomes. Education is even related to a higher likelihood of voting. And so all of these things are outcomes that don't just benefit you, but benefit everybody in society. So education is something that really touches on lots of other policy areas like healthcare and, of course, income inequality. So that's a big one because increasingly lots of people in society are concerned about growing income inequality and wealth inequality. And education is really one of the great engines of social mobility. And so that's why ensuring educational opportunities is really such an important issue. One thing, though, that we have to be worried about is that even though education can be a force for social mobility and for reducing inequalities, we also don't want to have a situation where it really just reinforces existing inequalities in society. So to the extent that not everyone has equal educational opportunities, we can actually see education contributing to a widening of those disparities instead of a reduction. There's this one statistic, it's really simple and it certainly doesn't tell the whole story, but I use it a lot because it kind of says so much to me, which is there's a study a few years ago that found that there are 38 colleges and universities in the United States that enroll more students from the top 1% of the income distribution. So these are, the 1%ers that you hear so much about, the wealthiest of the wealthiest. They have more students from those families than they have from the entire bottom 60% of the income distribution. And, these are well-known elite universities. So clearly you don't need to go to an elite university, an Ivy League school or something like that to have opportunities for economic mobility. So that's not my point. But it is clear that to some extent, to the extent that we see those kinds of patterns, education can just also reinforce and even grow existing inequalities.
Thank you. I really love those examples. And the next question that I'm going to ask you sort of gets to some of those inequalities. But, I was listening to this podcast the other day on education, and, they were talking about specifically SAT scores and how that's a source of inequality, because those who do well on the SAT scores are really those who come from higher socioeconomic background.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing they said that on it was that at high school, sort of applying to the jobs applying to colleges, that whole period is one of the most important period in someone's life in terms of social mobility. And I just feel like, having been, especially for us at Georgia State, I think that really is something that inspires me personally to be able to facilitate that a little bit for our students. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the difficult parts of it's difficult when it comes to education, the fact that schools are in some ways expected to overcome all of the inequalities that students face in the rest of their lives. I mean, tends to be the case that on average, families with higher incomes tend to have the time and the resources to invest more in their children's education. So one of the ways that this plays out a lot is with taking standardized tests, the SAT and the ACT. Parents with more means can pay for tutoring, they can pay for SAT prep courses and things like that. And so then that can help students to get higher standardized test scores. Then to the extent that colleges make important admissions decisions based in part on those standardized test scores, again, it can also help to just reflect societal inequalities instead of reduce them.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'm going to ask you the next question, which is asking about inequality in a specific way. So the students ask, to what degree do you believe the funding and financing structures for public school in the United States impact the presence or absence of educational equity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I would say that money or resources for public schools are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to eliminate or reduce inequalities in education. So there's tons of research, including research that I've done, showing that there are huge differences in the resources that students get in school and huge differences in how much is spent on education. And so one of the things in the US is that because we have this very decentralized system with the federal government, state governments, and local governments all contributing to education, we see the differences play out at each of those levels. So what I mean by that is that some states on average spend much more on education than other states, so that students in the high spending states have more resources devoted to them than students in the low spending states. Even within each of those states though, we know that wealthier school districts tend to spend more on average than less wealthy school districts. And when I say wealthy, I'm talking in particular about property tax wealth, because most of the money for education is raised from the property tax, at least by school districts. And so when you have some school districts that have huge property wealth, lots and lots of very expensive houses, they can raise a lot of money for education. Other school districts that don't have that kind of property tax base can't raise as much for education. And so we see big differences across those school districts. Another part though that I've done a lot of research on that a lot of people are less aware of is that particularly in big school districts with lots of schools, there's also huge differences across schools within the same school district in terms of the resources that they have. And so trying to address the inequalities at each of those different levels is really tough. One of the things that states do is they try to offset some of those differences in property wealth. So in other words, less wealthy school districts will tend to get more money from the state than wealthier school districts do. And that's the case in really every state to some extent, but in most states, they don't even come close to really overcoming those differences in wealth. So at least the resources that a student gets, or the resources that are spent on a student's education, really are dependent on the state they live in, the school district within the state, and even the school that they attend within a particular school district. So, but when I say that it's necessary but not sufficient, what I mean is just throwing money at the problem doesn't really work. There's lots of research showing that there are more effective and less effective ways to spend money. So, we have good evidence that things like smaller class sizes can really have an effect on student performance. And there's been lots of really good, rigorous evidence about that. But even that becomes kind of difficult to implement in practice because there aren't enough high quality teachers to go around. So a number of years ago, for example, California looked at this research and said, okay, we're going to reduce class sizes. We're going to spend a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars, to reduce class sizes all across the state. What ended up happening is, even though they were able to hire more teachers and have smaller classes, the wealthier school districts were able to hire the best teachers away from the poorer school districts, so that the poorer school districts, even though they had more teachers, they tended to be new teachers, less experienced teachers, teachers who hadn't really hit their stride yet. And so it didn't do as much as we would have hoped to reduce those inequalities. But at the same time, without addressing those differences in resources, there's probably not much hope that we're going to be able to make much of a dent in inequalities in educational opportunities and educational outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We had Dr. Jure Capers for one of our other conversations, and something she said sort of aligns with what you're saying, that, in addition to resources, you said quality of teachers, she was also talking about matching sort of the socioeconomic and racial background of teachers with that of students, right. And that match can really help the student performance. And so I think it's really a systemic issue, and I think resources, I really resonate with that. The fact that you say resources are necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, teachers are obviously such a key to this. You've got to have enough high quality teachers, and you've got to get them where they are needed the most. So money can help with that, but it doesn't always. So for example, trying to pay teachers, offering teachers bonuses to work in high need schools. Unfortunately, there's evidence that that's really, really expensive because teachers don't like to move schools. And so you'd have to really pay them a lot of money to get them to move from, say, a low poverty school to a high poverty school. So it's not always that straightforward, but absolutely teachers are, a huge part of the answer.
And I think another critical piece of the puzzle is also support to the students in terms of scholarships, when they pursue higher education. So the next question is about that. So the student is asking, to be eligible and maintain the Hope Scholarship and the Zell Miller Scholarship, students must maintain a certain GPA even before they enter college and all throughout their college careers. So in your opinion, do you believe the Hope Scholarship and Zell Miller Scholarship effectively help students of all races and household incomes equally, or does it benefit the higher income families more? I guess it also goes back to what we were talking about, SAT and ACT scores.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and you've really zeroed in on a lot of what I do my research on. This one actually has an easy answer, but I'll still say more. The easy answer is, does it equally benefit students across socioeconomic groups? No, absolutely not. The programs, Hope Scholarships and Zell Miller Scholarships in particular, as they're currently structured, there's no question that the benefits are more likely to flow to middle and upper income households. So a long time ago, I guess 20 years ago at this point, when the Hope Scholarship program was new and before the Zell Miller Scholarship program started, I did research with a colleague of mine where we looked not only at who benefits from lottery funded programs, but also who spends money on the lottery. So the Hope Scholarship and Zell Miller scholarships are funded entirely by state lottery revenue. And also the state's pre-kindergarten program is funded by lottery revenue. And so we looked at who's playing the lottery, we looked at who's going to pre-K, who's benefiting from Hope scholarships. And what we found is that lower income households spend a much higher share of their income playing the lottery as compared to higher income households. And at the same time, higher income households get much more benefit from merit scholarships as compared to lower income households, because they're the ones who tend to be sending students to college more frequently. And so what that ends up meaning is you have this big income transfer going on, where you have lower income households spending the money to support programs that are more likely to benefit middle and upper income households. And then recently, I've been doing some work, and some colleagues of mine have been doing work looking at Hope and Zell Miller. And so I can tell you absolutely that there are huge differences by race and by income in who gets the scholarships, particularly the Zell Miller scholarship. So the Zell Miller scholarship, which is the full tuition scholarship, as you might know, Hope used to be a full tuition scholarship, used to provide full tuition, fees, and a book allowance. Now it just provides partial tuition. The Zell Miller scholarship provides full tuition. And so there are huge differences in who qualifies for a Zell Miller scholarship out of high school. So white students are about 6 times more likely than Black students to qualify for a Zell Miller scholarship. Students from families with incomes over $100,000 are, I think, about 4 or 5 times more likely to qualify for a Zell Miller scholarship as compared to students from families with incomes under $30,000. So these are tremendous differences in who is likely to get a full tuition scholarship. We see similar differences when it comes to the Hope Scholarship, but they're not nearly as large. So it's still the case that white students are more likely to earn Hope scholarships as compared to Black students. Higher income students are more likely to earn a Hope scholarship as compared to students from lower income households. The differences aren't quite as large. But then when you look at who gets any merit scholarship, so you combine Hope and Zell Miller, you see that I think it's only about 20% of white students, a little over 20% of white students start college in Georgia without any merit scholarship at all. But about 50% of Black students start college in Georgia without either the Hope Scholarship or the Zell Miller Scholarship. So these are just tremendous disparities. And then with a colleague of mine, I've been doing some other work actually looking at what happens after students enroll in college, because as you know, you can lose the Hope Scholarship or the Zell Miller Scholarship if you fall below a certain GPA, but you can also get the scholarship for the first time in college. You could lose a scholarship that you gained in college. So there's lots of kind of complicated dynamics of gaining and losing scholarships. And so we're looking at that. Unfortunately, that study hasn't been approved for release yet. So in a few weeks, I could tell you what we found. I can't tell you right now, but we'll see what happens. It may be in the news. We'll see when the report comes out.
I can't wait to know more about it. It sounds so important, for us to know. And also, as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so what's the solution? So I think in general, when we think about social issue, there's this capabilities first argument versus needs first argument, and it sounds like that's a similar divide in this case. And so what would be a good solution if you were to advise, somebody to redesign these scholarships?
Well, one thing I would do is I would certainly take the Hope Scholarship and the Zell Miller Scholarship back to the way it used to work, at least in terms of eliminating the standardized test requirement. So Hope for decades operated strictly based on high school GPA and college GPA. But then when the Zell Miller Scholarship came into existence, they added a minimum SAT or ACT score in order to get the scholarship. In my mind, there's really no reason for that. If the concern is grade inflation, I've done research, or at least in the past, I did research that didn't find any evidence that the Hope Scholarship Program, before there was an SAT or SET requirement, increased grade inflation in Georgia. There is grade inflation. There's lots of evidence that there's grade inflation all over the country, but there's no evidence that the Hope Scholarship Program accelerated it or made it worse. And so adding the SAT or ACT requirement, in my mind, really kind of tried to address a problem that didn't exist. And at the same time, added to these inequalities, because as we already talked about, students from families with more time and more resources are better able to take advantage of the kind of help that can raise standardized test scores. So by adding that in, you're really making the situation worse. So I would eliminate the SAT or ACT score requirement. That's one thing I would do. Also, in terms of keeping the scholarship in college, right now, particularly with the Hope Scholarship, it's this very strict cutoff. So if you fall below a 3.0, you lose your scholarship entirely. And there isn't necessarily any reason to do it that way. So for example, you could make it easier for students to keep their scholarships while they're in college, because we know that so many students do lose the scholarship in college. So you could think about things like, instead of saying, if you fall below a 3.0, you lose 100% of your scholarship. Say if you fall between a 2.75 and a 3.0, you lose maybe 75% of your scholarship. And at 2.5, you lose 50% of your scholarship, something like that, just so that it becomes less likely that students who lose their scholarship will end up having to drop out because they don't have the means to continue.
That's great. Those are such concrete solutions. And, it reminds me, I think somewhere you mentioned Raj Chetty, I think in the video that you recorded for this class, his research and maybe your own research, it looks like saying the same thing about how high school scores are a good predictor of college performance, and then ACT and SAT over and above high school scores can predict a small percentage of college performance, but largely, I think high school scores are sufficient. And somewhere I read about Texas A&M and how they bring together their freshman class. And what they did was that they took the top 10% from each high school in the state, And so what they bring together is this hugely diverse class in terms of socioeconomic background. So no SAT, no ACT. And then they put together these resources around tutoring, around counseling, around support groups, to bring, the students sort of lift elbow, tide lifts all boats. So I just thought that was such a great model of, challenging, but such a great model of really a high, like Research One, high quality school, using high school scores to bring a diverse set of students together.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the great things also that you mentioned are the support programs in college. And so Georgia State actually has become a national model for doing that. I think a lot of people probably don't know that in the higher education world, Georgia State has actually become really famous because of all of the really innovative kinds of programs that the universities implemented to try and increase graduation rates, reduce disparities in graduation rates, improve college success. And one of them is a program called Keep Hope Alive that helps students try to retain their Hope scholarships, which you would think most schools would do, but actually they don't. It's kind of unique in the state.
That's great. That's really great to know. So the next question I want to ask you is a little bit related to that. Georgia is one of the last states to not provide needs-based scholarships. While the legislation was passed to create needs-based scholarship through HOPE, I believe as of now, it has yet to be funded. Why do you think the state is opposed to this, given the surplus in lottery funds that could be used? Based on your research, is funding needs-based scholarship a poor fiscal decision?
So this is a really good question. Whoever wrote this question really knew their stuff, because This is something that probably most people aren't aware of, that Georgia, unlike most other states, doesn't provide any need-based aid. So one way you can look at it, and I think what a lot of people would argue about Georgia, is that we actually do provide a lot of financial aid for college, or the state does provide a lot of financial aid for college. So if you look at statistics just on the total amount of financial aid from the state per student, Georgia is almost always at or near the top, usually in the top 5 or the top 3 among states for providing the most financial aid. But as we talked about, that's because of merit aid and because so many students get merit aid. It has nothing to do with need-based aid because we basically don't have need-based aid in Georgia. The second part of the question, why don't we have need-based aid? That's a tougher question to answer. In some ways, that's a little bit outside my area of expertise. So I sometimes think about the field of, and this is a gross generalization, and so for all of you who are political science majors, don't take this too literally, but I sometimes think about political science as studying how policies come to be enacted, and policy analysis as being about what happens after those policies are enacted. What are the effects of those policies? So most of my research tends to focus on that second part. What are the effects of policies? I don't really study how policies do or don't end up being enacted. So I'd be kind of talking off the top of my head in terms of why we don't have it. But one thing to think about is who the constituency is for merit-based aid versus need-based aid. So one of the things about merit-based aid in Georgia is that it is pretty broad-based. A lot of students benefit from it. So in the university system, somewhere around 70% of students are getting some form of merit-based aid, whether it's Hope or Zell Miller. And the percentages are especially high at the state's research universities. So Georgia State, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia. So that means that you've got these really broad-based benefits, and that's pretty popular politically. Need-based aid, on the other hand, by definition, is going to be much more focused. It's not going to focus across the board, so you wouldn't likely see 70% of families getting some kind of need-based aid. You'd see a much smaller share of families getting it. So politically, I think it probably tends to be less popular. It tends to have less advocacy behind it, less of a political constituency. That's kind of my take on it. And also because so many families are getting some form of financial aid. The other part of the question, do I think it's a poor fiscal decision? I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean by a poor fiscal decision, but certainly in my view, no. Need-based aid can be a great investment. Anything that gets more students who wouldn't otherwise have gone to college to go to college can be a good investment for everybody. The research evidence on the effects of need-based aid is not quite as strong as you might think, because it's actually kind of hard to figure out what effect it has. So when you have programs like need-based aid where only some students can benefit, it's hard to make those comparisons. So for example, we can't just compare students who qualify for need-based aid to students who don't qualify for need-based aid and see who's more likely to go to college or who's more likely to graduate college, because they're different students. They come from different families, different socioeconomic backgrounds. So really getting at those differences that are caused by the aid itself are a little bit hard to get at. But certainly the evidence suggests that providing more need-based aid gets more students to go to college. One of the big downsides to need-based aid is it's really complicated. So any of you who have filled out the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, you're probably aware of this. It's gotten better over the years, but it's complicated, hard to figure out, particularly if you have no experience with it. Nobody in your family's been to college before, even for people who have lots of kids or who went to college themselves. It can be hard to track down all the information that you need, fill it out. And even then, you don't find out until later whether you can afford college, or at least how much aid you'll be getting. So one of the benefits of merit aid, like Hope scholarships, is it is very transparent. You know, almost every student in Georgia knows, what do I need to do to earn a Hope scholarship? What do I need to do to earn a Zell Miller scholarship? Need-based aid would probably have more of an effect if we could make it also more transparent, make it easier for students to know up front that they can afford college, how much financial aid they'll be getting, so that they can make that a part of their plans.
That's great. And so I think you began with this statement about Georgia, and in the question also the students asked about Georgia being sort of, one of the few states or lowest in the sort of hierarchy. So I'm assuming there's variance across states. So do you know which states are on the top of that list in terms of needs-based aid?
I don't actually. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, because I'm just wondering to your, what you shared in terms of, maybe politics behind deciding that. I did wonder if there's sort of, more progressive states more behind needs-based aid versus more conservative states. Yeah.
I don't actually know off the top of my head which other states provide more aid overall. I mean, pretty much every state provides more need-based aid than Georgia, since we don't need. But in terms of need-based aid, also the federal government is really the biggest piece of it, through programs like the Pell Grant program. So that's where a lot of students' need-based aid comes from. And it's also important to keep in mind that colleges themselves can provide financial aid, both need-based aid and merit aid. So when I've been talking about merit aid, I've been talking about state programs like Hope and Zell Miller, but particularly private colleges actually spend a lot of their own money also on both need-based aid and merit-based financial aid. So that's one of the things that kind of gets lost in the story about how expensive college is. The sticker price at private universities in particular is very, very high. And we all know that, and it gets a lot of attention. But what gets less attention is that a lot of that money that comes in from students who can afford to pay full tuition is then spent on providing financial aid for students who can't afford to pay full tuition. So typically those kinds of transfers are going on. So it doesn't look quite as bad as it might if you only looked at the price that they advertise. Public universities sometimes do, sometimes don't, but public universities tend not to have as much money as private universities, and tuition is much lower. So on average, they don't provide usually as much merit-based aid or need-based aid as private colleges do.
Yeah, makes sense. So the last question I have for you, Ross, is, should each state have a proposed framework to address the educational inequalities based on their average revenue? And what is the role of the federal government in covering any of the deficit?
This is a good question too, because I think that one of the things most people, I'm talking not people who are in public policy programs, but just your average citizen, doesn't really know or understand about our educational system is how little of a role the federal government actually plays. So for the most part, when we talk about education policy, we're talking about 50 different state systems. There is no national education system in the United States. Everything is entirely state-based. And the federal government doesn't provide much money at all for education. So usually about 10% or a little less of total spending on education. And when I say education here, I'm just talking about elementary and secondary, so K-12 education. But the vast majority, about 90% of that money, comes from state governments and from school districts. So that means as things are currently configured, it's hard for the federal government to do very much to try to overcome these inequalities. And for the most part, this goes back to the US Constitution. So the US Constitution lays out very specific responsibilities for the federal government, things like providing national defense and regulating commerce and things like that. Anything else is a state responsibility, anything that's not mentioned in the Constitution. And education is not mentioned in the Constitution. So that means it's mostly up to the states. So the federal government over time has gotten involved. We went back 100 years. The federal government really played almost no role at all in education. Over time, it's gotten bigger. Spending has gotten bigger. And there are programs like Title I, for example, which is the biggest federal government program to provide additional funding to high poverty schools. So the federal government does get involved to some extent, but because the money is really so small compared to state and local contributions, it's hard for the federal government, it's hard for federal money to really make much of a dent. So it really is up to states, as the question suggests. So even though the federal Constitution, the US Constitution, doesn't mention education, every state has its own constitution. And every state constitution does mention education and makes it an explicit responsibility of the state. They all use slightly different language. So for example, in Georgia, it says that provision of an adequate education is the state's responsibility. So what does that mean? Adequate education. Well, nobody knows exactly what adequate means. And so most states have ended up being sued by typically parents and families in high poverty or low wealth school districts who argue that the state isn't meeting its constitutional obligation to provide education in whatever form the state constitution requires. So Georgia got sued decades ago with the plaintiffs arguing, families arguing that the state isn't meeting its obligation to provide an adequate education. Georgia happened to have won the case. So they weren't required legally to put any more money into education or to try and equalize spending anymore across school districts. Other states have lost their cases in court, and so they've been required legally to try and offset some of the disparities in education. But even in Georgia, even though they lost the case, the state still did adopt a new school funding system to try and provide more equality in educational spending across school districts. So there's definitely a state responsibility. And really the primary responsibility for overcoming educational inequalities rests with the state. You know, you can't expect school districts necessarily to do it. You can't expect Atlanta public schools to do anything about education in Chatham County, for example, or Gwinnett County. But it is the state's responsibility to try and ensure that students, no matter where they attend school, have access to adequate resources and adequate educational opportunities. But keep in mind, legally speaking, adequate does not necessarily mean equal or equitable. And so that's where a lot of the difficulties lie. At least here I'm talking from a legal standpoint as opposed to a policy standpoint.
So, if we think that, if we agree that education is sort of a human right, and so by its very nature, different states will have different revenue. So what is the logic behind federal government giving this responsibility to the state? Wouldn't you, if you want to, accept and, make education, high quality education equally available, why wouldn't the federal government be the primary responsible entity?
Well, we're kind of stuck with the language in the US Constitution ultimately. So really when the federal government even started getting involved at all in education, they had to find ways to kind of couch it in constitutional terms or ways that would pass muster with the Constitution. So just to give you an example, in the 1950s, one of the big increases in education spending from the federal government was something called the National Defense Education Act. And so it was kind of promoted as, this was in the 1950s, and we had the space race, and there was a lot of concern about the Soviet Union beating us to get into space and things like that. And we had the Cold War, and we were competing with the Soviet Union. And so they kind of formulated this as not being about education as much as being about promoting national defense, by trying to promote better education as a way to improve our national defense, have more students studying science, things that could help us in the space race and in the arms race and things like that. And it seems kind of silly, but part of the reason for that was because if the federal government had just decided, you know what, we're just going to ramp up spending on education and take over school systems, constitutionally, that probably wouldn't work, because there'd probably be legal cases. It would go to the Supreme Court, and ultimately probably would be found to be unconstitutional. In fact, there have been school finance cases, or there was a school finance case that found its way to the US Supreme Court. If the plaintiffs, the families who were suing, arguing that their state's funding system was unconstitutional, had won, the hope was that this would set a precedent so that the federal government could play a more active role in promoting educational equality and educational opportunity, at least in terms of finances, but they lost. And so the Supreme Court ruled that education is not a fundamental right under the US Constitution. And so, to be honest, there hasn't been a lot of activity since then. There's always talk about it, and it could happen again, but ultimately, in terms of the federal role, it really ends up coming down to these constitutional issues.
And did that change at all in the pandemic? Because I remember there was a lot of federal aid directed to high Pell Grant, students, colleges with high percentage of Pell Grant students. So was that an exception that the federal government made, or was that how did they make that happen?
Well, it's interesting because we actually tend to do things differently in higher education than we do in K-12 education in a lot of cases. So it's still the case in higher education that most higher education systems are state-based. There really isn't a federal higher education system, but we do provide aid directly to students, like we've talked about. Pell Grants come directly from the federal government to students. Students can then take those Pell Grants and use them at any college or university, any accredited college or university in the country, whether it's public or private. We don't do anything like that in K-12 education, though. And in fact, doing it is a hugely controversial issue. So it's essentially a voucher program. And so the idea of giving families money that they could then use to pay tuition at any elementary or secondary school, public or private, at the federal level has never happened, and would probably be challenged immediately in court if that did happen. So it's hard to explain why we treat higher education and K-12 education somewhat differently, but we do tend to. And I don't want to suggest that there's no federal money going to education, because, as I said, about 10% of the total amount of spending does come from the federal government. But it's also not mandatory that states take that money. So one of the interesting things that happened back when the No Child Left Behind Act was first passed, so this was when George W. Bush was president, and it was a big increase in federal involvement in education. So the federal government was saying that states had to adopt standards, test students, ensure that students were making adequate yearly progress. And that was really one of the biggest increases in the federal role in education in American history. And there were a couple of states, or at least one state I can think of, who initially said, we're not going to do it. And the federal government couldn't require them to do it. All the federal government could do was to say, okay, you don't have to do it, but you're not getting your Title I money if you don't do it. And they were willing to make that trade. So they were willing to turn down federal money so that they didn't have to follow these federal laws about testing students and reporting on test scores and things like that. So ultimately, when it comes to education, states, in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, states have the final say. And certainly there are exceptions. So for example, things like discrimination. states don't have a legal right. So that's what the very famous Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision that struck down segregation in schooling was about. That was different because that was all about discrimination. And so states don't have that constitutional right. But as long as they're not violating these kinds of fundamental rights, states do have a lot of discretion to do things the way they want.
Oh, very, very interesting, Ross. So that's sort of the questions I had. Is there anything we didn't discuss that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I mean, these are great questions, and it's, you know, so important to really understand these issues and to get involved, and, you know, to the extent that you can, read research and go out and do your research about different policy issues, and especially with education. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's so important. And you all know how important education is because you're in college. And so it's kind of your responsibility then to pay that forward by continuing these discussions and being informed and educated about these issues.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you I really enjoyed how concrete and evidence-based your answers and comments were. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Ross.
Thanks for having me. Hope I'll see you all in person at some point.
You bet. Thank you.